But in a way, remain in many ways as good antiquarianism useless. I revive it, I make it alive again, but yet it's ephemeral, and it's just, okay, who cares that Hart Crane was in La Habana yelling, they are going to throw rats in the port of La Habana, and they are going to get typhus in La Habana. These Mexican and American doctors are infecting La Habana with typhus. Nobody cares. It's not really important in the story, but it's beautiful. And it's very interesting for an antiquarianism to find that these doctors are with Hart Crane, so to speak, a la Gallo, which always finding these short stories, these little secrets of history here and there. It's very fun. Now, the only thing I wanted to do is, at the end, when I was conscious, inspired by reading Carlos and others, that I was not going to be able to be just critical, and I was in the end extremely antiquarian, and in a way also monumental. If you notice some claims when I read this to give a talk last week, you never reread your books. I don't know you, Claudio, but I tend not to do it. So I had to read it. And I said, what pretentious, what a huge argument. You know, like I'm trying to make the Mexico City trying to say so much about the idea of modern times themselves in such a monumental way. That at the end, I think that in terms of this Nietzsche approach you want, I wanted the book to be un-Mexicanist, because it's in English, and I wanted to be in English to give this lesson, but also I wanted to show how in the end, modestly, for a historian who has been exercising the profession for 20 years, the only thing you can deliver is a good fight between antiquarianism, monumental history, and critical history. And this is my good fight. You judge whether it's a good fight. Now, the state architecture, it's walk in cities, and you know, I must confess that this book is also full a report of limitations. For instance, I can very easily deal with language because I learned it in the Monsiváis erudition, and in a way, it's what Monsiváis did in many ways, in many aspects. But there was one thing Monsiváis bothered me throughout, and it's the hiding of a profound erudition. Monsiváis wanted to show us that he wanted the boleros, but he never told us how much American poetry he knew, how much he talked about French poetry. He knew everything, but he became a clown of himself, and always exiled that clown because he wanted to be funny all the time, and he was. But at the end, I think it became like, forgive me if I say this in New York, like Woody Allen, repeating the same movie several times. And I wanted to be, as a scholar, you know, I don't have to hide my erudition. If I want to talk about Tagore or Japan, or I want to talk about haiku, and at the same time that boleros, or at the same time I want to talk about philology and Nahuatlismo and this, I want to talk. He always hid it. He always, except for 2 or 3 essays. So I wanted to be, I don't say a professional Monsiváis, and I never meant to be, let alone in English. But the Monsiváis effect is there. It's ingrained, as they say in English, is wired in our minds. We want to read like Monsiváis, the city. But I didn't want to be merely a clown. I wanted to say something that is worth the salary I have in Chicago in terms of research and things like that. The architecture, you know, I have another limitation I have is I try better than in the first book you mentioned. But I am aware I'm not an art historian, not a historian of architecture. And we historians, you know, vulgares, común y corrientes, like myself, now because we are very hipsters, use images all the time. Or talk about architectures and forms all the time. But of course, we only touch the basis of this, because when I read art historians, or when I walk, also my friend Matiko here present, who is a very good historian of architecture, walking in Barcelona, has made me see 3 or 4 Barcelonas I never saw, regardless of all the many walks I had done in Barcelona, because my eyes are not trained as a historian of architecture. My eyes are very conservative, trained as a conservative historian. I learn many other things in the craft, but I'm not an expert on this. What I can tell is the story of the contextual aspects of architecture. And what I have to learn by archives, not by the structures in themselves, is that there are a lot of freedom of selection and option. But it's not, when talking about massive architecture projects, it's not as free as you think. Neoclassical was not an option. Neoclassical was what you had to do regardless of wherever you are. Whether it's Washington, D.C., or Mexico City, or Buenos Aires, 1900, you want to do this is what you have to do. The tackiness or the cursileria or the gaudy aspects of things is more a matter of location than a matter of whether you do it well or not. Some building that is neoclassical in the middle of Mexico City and looks extremely tacky in the middle of Paris could look like the Opera House or extremely high class, or it's just a matter of location. It's experimental. Yes, it's extremely experimental. This book and the other book I published in English many years ago is about delimiting the space where architects, politicians, professional historians experiment, but it's not limitless. You have certain aspects you can experiment, but depending on the moment, depending on the circumstances, you experiment with certain things and you fail. And when it starts to work, it becomes what political science call path dependent. Because, they experimented in 1889 with indigenous architecture. It was a total failure. France ridiculed Mexico. They said, this is awful. 30 years after, or 40 years after, it became extremely successful. Why was it different? The attempt? No. The experiment is the same. We're always experimenting. The circumstances have changed because in terms of styles and architecture, things keep changing and changing and changing. And when it was a tacky experiment in Paris in 1889, in 1929 was extremely successful. And what it was, and think about Diego Rivera himself. Diego Rivera was a Cubist artist in Paris for 20 years. He wasn't painting Indians. Why was he painting Indians then? Because it was the hipster thing to do. Not because he was returning to anything. He was actually reaching that stage in which he was becoming as avant-garde as possible in doing this and in being so successful. Then he couldn't stop. And the same did this experiment, all in very political, very official historiography of the Porfiriato. Yes, we all historians of the Porfiriato emphasize that. In part, you know why? Because of the nature of the evidence. The Porfiriato was extremely successful in creating, from Guillermo Kahlo picturing all the buildings, official buildings produced by the Porfiriato, to all the archives I have exploited over my career of discussing the monument is going to be like this, the monument is going to be like that, we are going to use this system, which a Porfiriato created immense amount of documents, and we love it. The private architecture of the Porfiriato, I've been trying, especially in order to experiment the American effect. The effect, as a historian of NYU calls the American temptation in architecture. In the private architecture of Mexico, the American temptation was everywhere. You want to go to the architecture of La Colonia Juárez, La Colonia Cuauhtémoc, and all the private architecture, it was done by American companies. You decide the style, they do it with iron structures, not with real stone, which Mexican official architectures thought it was wrong. And it's very, I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it's like narco architecture today. It's like you go to La Piedad, where I was born, or you go to the, you have all the styles because all these people have money, hire some American company or some Mexican architecture which buy the software from American companies and get you your house like in Miami or in California, which is Mexican style or California style in the middle of La Piedad, and you have it there. It's very there, and it's difficult to examine. I did not examine many of the documents about interiors or private places in the Porfiriato because it's hard to find. The two reasons I did some in 1910 is because of the many pictures of mansions were taken in order to house the diplomats. And so they send the photographs, and you have the Guillermo Landa y Escandón house, different things. Now, modern photojournalism was not alive in 1900 or 1910. People were not going to see how the other half lives until later. And so we didn't have pictures of interiors of vecindades or houses in Mexico City until the 1920s, when the journalists started to get lost there. And by the 1930s, it's fashionable. You have Weston going there and photographing this place, or you have people trying to do research. But it was very difficult to find images about this, and that's why we historians are bound to this. If you read Ángel de Campo, Micros, he has descriptions, literary descriptions of the popular interiors in Porfirian Mexico. But it's very difficult to find images until the 1920s and 30s, where you have photojournalism, and then you have anthropologists, you have hygienists, doctors visiting things and recording things and photographing things. But before, it's very difficult to get into that. And that's why we historians tend to focus on these massive official plans, because they leave a lot of records. Every single monument you see in Avenida Reforma, not the Ángel de la Independencia, the ones at the side, you have records for everything and why every state decided that particular person, what the local historians say about that particular person. For every mansion that there used to be in Juarez Avenue, there is no such a record. And that's why we focus on that.
Another round, we have Carlos Pereda.
I don't know exactly how to put my minor remark without producing a misunderstanding, but I will try. In your great book, really it's a great book, you discuss a lot of important questions. One of these questions is a description of the intellectuals and of the culture in Mexico City and in general in Mexico in a certain period of time. But I don't know how I found your description in a certain way too affirmative, too positive, that you make something like a description only of the virtues of this culture. And my suspicion was that perhaps this interesting perspective come from the relation that you introduce, and that is, I think, a very important relationship between history and poetry. Perhaps if you introduce another relationship, for example, between history and science, or social science, or philosophy, the description of that you do about the culture in Mexico and of the intellectuals, perhaps you could also introduce some vices.